We are going to be in Exodus chapter 12, talking about one of the premier feasts that will be an identifier of the Jewish people from this point all the way up until present. This is something that is still practiced and still very much in their culture, and so and it has precursors to things in the Christian faith that we would hold dear to as well. And so I'm looking forward to getting into that. So would someone be willing to read? We're only going to go through verse 28 tonight. We're not going to get to the 10th plague actually happening and the first fruits and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We're not going to go all the way into that. It's just a big chunk to bite off. We're just going to be doing and dealing with the Passover instruction. So would somebody be willing to read chapter 12, verses 1 through 28 for us?
I'll be willing to do it.
Awesome.
The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb according to their father's house, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of persons, according to what each can eat. You shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of this month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and the lintel of the house in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted on the fire, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roast it, its head with its legs and its inner parts. And you shall let none of it remain until the morning. Any that remains until the morning you shall burn. In this manner you shall eat it, with your belt fastened, your sandal on your feet, and your staff in your hand. And you shall eat in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. This day shall be for you a memorial day. You shall keep it as a feast to the Lord. Throughout your generations, as a statute forever, you shall keep it as a feast. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven out of the house. For if anyone eats what is leavened from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day you shall hold a holy assembly, and on the 7th day a holy assembly. No work shall be done on those days, but whatever one needs to eat, that alone may be prepared by you. And you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread. For on this very day, I brought you, your host, out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as a statute forever. In the first month, from the 14th day of the month at the evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. From 7 days, no leaven is to be found in your houses. If anyone eats what is leavened, that person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he is a sojourner or a native of the land. You shall eat nothing leavened in all your dwelling places. You shall eat unleavened bread. Then Moses called the elders of Israel and said to them, "Go and select lambs for yourselves according to your clans, and kill the Passover lamb. Take a bunch of hyssop and dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and touch the lintel and the two doorposts with the blood that is in the basin. None of you shall go out of the door of his house until morning. For the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the two doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not allow the destroyer into your houses to strike you. You shall observe this rite as a statute for you and your sons forever. And when you come to the land the Lord will give you, as he has promised, you shall keep this service. And when your children say to you, what do you mean by this service? You shall say, it is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover, for he passed over the houses of the people of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians but spared our houses. And the people bowed their heads and worshipped. Then the people of Israel went and did so, as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. So they did.
Awesome. That dramatic reading was brought to you by Jonathan Heimbach. So we're so delighted that he was able to do that for us. So as we kind of dive into this, all joking aside, that was awesome. Anyway, so as we dive into this, really the first verse and the first point you'll see on the PowerPoint is Passover will forever be ingrained in the life of Israel from this point forward. It will be referred to time and time and time and time again, not only to remind Israel of the past works of God, but also to encourage them to continue to be the nation of priests that they were called to be and that they will be called to be through the law. And more than likely, we have here in the institution of Passover something that they never even thought of, right? So I would imagine, again, this is kind of conjecture, but I would imagine that there wasn't much paying attention to the calendar while they were in slavery, right? Because you pretty much just did what Pharaoh told you to do, and that's pretty much it. Also, they would have had no reason to pay attention. They didn't have feasts that they were keeping at that point. And so there would be no reason. They would follow along basically with whatever the Egyptians were doing. My point in pointing this out is exactly what is being said here at the beginning of chapter 12. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month shall be for you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year for you. That is significant in the fact that he seems to be instituting them. There are differing theological viewpoints about this, but he seems to be instituting them as a nation. Like, this is where your history with me will continue. Like, you pick up from when you were in slavery for these 400 and some odd years, and this point forward will be something new that I'm doing in and through you as I bring you up out of the land of Egypt. Does that make sense? Any pushback on that? Any thoughts?
No, it's essentially the same thing as AD. It creates a point in the calendar that changes all of history in reference to this point forever and ever. For
the Israelites,
yes.
Absolutely, yeah. There's one commentator that I was reading that says this. It's just, I found this quote to be extremely helpful. It says, when Pharaoh is in charge of time, one's days become an endless repetition of wearisome toil that in time may seem to go on forever. Past and future are just limitless extensions of an intolerable present. But what a monumental change happens in a person's life when God is in charge of one's time instead of Pharaoh. Expectation replaces resignation. Hope replaces numbness. Rhapsody replaces routine. Celebration replaces drudgery. And that's kind of what you have going on here in the institution of this Passover that they will then continue to uphold. Because this will be a point from which they will celebrate the works of the Lord. Because they haven't really had that up to this point in Egypt, in their experience with Egypt. They've been following along with the gods of Egypt. They've been kind of going along with this whole slavery thing that they've been enslaved in since at least the second generation after Joseph. And so as we kind of grapple with this, there's a reason why this event is so significant in the life of Israel. And is pointed to time and time again, not only through the Old Testament, but also into the New. There's a reason why John, the gospel writer, in which we're studying in sermon, he structures a great deal of his gospel around the feasts. He's one of the gospel writers. Him and I think Luke mention the feast the most, but John structures a lot of what he does. He says, and at this feast, Jesus did this, and at this feast, this is what's going on. And so a lot of the significant events and signs, as John calls them, in his gospel are centered around these feasts of Israel. There are 3 of them that we have recorded in the gospel. And so as we kind of unpack this Passover, I want to just at the outset say that this is something just so monumental in the life of Israel. I don't know if I could overstate how big of a deal that this would have been. Literally calendar altering, if you want to think of it that way. Because from now on, their year would track along from March to April is when Aviv would have been the month of Aviv, or Aviv. And so their year would be from April to March, April. That it was centered around the beginning of their year. And so again, I just wanted to mention that as we kind of go through it. Any questions about that? Any thoughts? I'm sure we'll unpack that a little bit more as we go through. But again, so ingrained in the life of Israel forever. It shall be in the first month of the year for you. Tell all the congregation of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, every man shall take a lamb according to their father's houses, a lamb for the household. And if the household is too small for a lamb, then he and his nearest neighbor shall take according to the number of persons, according to what each can eat. You shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male a year old. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats, and you shall keep it until the 14th day of the month, when the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill their lambs at twilight. So before we go on, what are some of y'all's preconceived ideas about what Passover is? And anybody can answer. What do you understand Passover to accomplish from watching Prince of Egypt or whatever it is, and then B, how is it significant in the rest of the story of Israel?
I mean, it's the Passover. Like, are you talking about the feast itself, or just the event of the Passover now? Sorry.
So obviously the event itself, and then what the feast memorializes.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I would just take the Passover as. I mean, that's the kind of the inception, really, the really getting to the ground of God redeeming his people and drawing them out of Israel. And I think the celebration of it then is kind of memorializing that, and also serving as sort of a way of thinking about God's dealings with them in the future, and how he is their redeemer, and how he will, at the time of the exile, redeem them again. And so I think it becomes the big word is paradigmatic, but just how the lens, how they see things in the world. They're just their thought process is going to be seen through sort of the act of the Passover and how God redeemed them there, and through the Exodus ultimately.
Absolutely.
I've always loved how these feasts are participatory. This feast is more than just remembering what God has done for him. Because I mean that's a huge, and probably 90% of the feast is remembering what God has done.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also a participatory nature of it. In the first one, you have you got to get this lamb, and then 4 days later, you're going to kill it and eat it. And then whatever's left, you got to burn it up. You make sure that when you eat it, you're dressed in a certain way, so you're ready to leave.
Right.
And then you're talking about later as you're remembering it, for a whole week, you can't have, not only can you not eat leaven, but not have leaven in your house.
Mm-hmm.
You got to go out of your way to make sure your dwelling is clean and sacred. All of this is pointing to two things that I think is really, really amazing about our God. First of all, he wants them to remember how they have been saved or freed from something. Free, in this case, free from Egypt. Mm-hmm. Much like we are remember how we've been saved or freed from sin. Mm-hmm. And then there's also the participatory nature, which is God did the saving, but we're remembering and participating in that salvation. More like they had to suffer the lamb, they had to be ready to go. The people have to make sure that their lives are representing that they are obeying the God that has freed them by keeping their houses clean, by not eating leaven.
Yeah,
I think it's really unique that same thing is seen in Jesus.
Yeah.
I think that's always the way it's been talked about for me, especially since I've had the opportunity to actually go to a couple Passovers, but it's always been Messianic Jews.
Yeah.
And so it's always been how Passover is a picture of salvation, of how they were redeemed through the loss of a firstborn son, and all of that, and how we need to remember that, but also walk in the light of Jesus who's made the ultimate sacrifice and stuff like that. So I think I've always had it talk to me in light of how does this look like salvation.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's interesting that not interesting, but it's demonstrative of the reality of the way that God works in the fact that you mentioned the exile.
Mhm.
because the really cool thing about God's economy is that God can do what he wants to. And he chose divinely, and I don't think it was coincidental or on accident, the leaving or the first leaving from Babylon. When does it happen? In the month of Aviv on the 14th day. Ezra is led out of Babylon. It's just it's so intriguing. Like it's like all of this stuff. Of course, at that point, it changes names to Nisan. So Aviv becomes Nisan later on in Israel's history. But they're talking of the same month. It's such an interesting component. Again, I don't really know how much. I'm not really sure what to make of it, other than the fact that God redeems. And as we celebrate that redemption, we should expectantly wait and hope in his continuous ability to do so. Right. And so I'm not saying that like we go out to the hillside every time that we think that Jesus ascended from the hillside, right? That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we should expectantly wait and rejoice and celebrate in the redemption of God. And I think with that, at the very least, I think that that's what is represented through God doing these two redemptions, if you will, like the quintessential redemptions of Israel in the Old Testament are from Egypt and the return from exile in Babylon. Like those are like the pillar points of redemptive act of God as it's seen. Now there are tons more. Please don't hear me say that God only redeemed them twice. But those two events are very significant in the life of Israel as they not only moved from Egypt to having their own land in Israel proper, but also coming back to Israel and then looking forward into the New Testament. And it's just interesting to me that they happen on the same, or they begin on the same month. Again, I'm not a numerologist or anything like that. It's just interesting how in God's economy he chooses to do these things in such a way that points to his continuous redemptive quality and his love for his people. So let's kind of dive into the instruction here. So God gives instruction to how this is supposed to take place, really stretching from verse 3 all the way through verse 20. This is God's instruction to Moses. And then God spends literally 17 verses describing this to Moses, and Moses turns around and describes it to the people in 7, which is interesting to me. It's just very intriguing.
Is this Moses' version of saying this could have been
No, definitely not. I don't think so. But it's just funny to me that that's how it happens. So we have in at least the first portion of God's instruction to Moses, really 5 parts of the feast of what's going to take place, at least in this first initial Passover. The first one is that people were to go on the 10th day and identify a lamb, right? So identify a lamb without blemish and all those things. And as they go and do this, this is not just I'm going to go out to my field and be like, sure, that one. No, this is supposed to be a great care act. Like this is something that you are offering to the Lord as a sacrifice for that which he is going to do. And so it's not something that you just flippantly go out and be like for instance, my dad and mom have goats, right? And they're cute as buttons when they're little, right? And when we went down, the reason this is in my mind is because when we went down for Christmas, Abigail got a hold of a goat for the first time, and it was really funny. But she was very flippant about the way that she treated this goat. She just literally reached under the little house and drug it out by its leg and like picked it up and was just like carrying it around like it was her baby. Because again, she felt like she could dominate this goat. More power to her. But this is not that. This is them caring over this thing that they have raised, and at the correct time, nearly a year old, which is a youngling for a goat or a sheep, or not a sheep, a lamb, and they are to then basically prepare this goat or lamb for slaughter. And this would be very, I don't want to say touching because I don't want to emotionalize this, but it's something that you have investment in. Like this is not just a flippant animal, right? This is an animal which you have invested much. And that's the way that it was meant to be for a lot of the feasts, is that it's not something that you just flippantly like, I guess I'll give God this one. sometimes like we do with our tithe, but the reality is that this is something special that they are taking out of the prospect of this lamb or this goat continuing to produce in their herd, and they are giving it over to God. So it's something special that's happening here. And the care with which they are to choose this lamb is spoken of in this particular passage. And it speaks to the number of people that it's supposed to cover, because it's not supposed to be wasteful, right? Which again, God's economy is trying to at least instruct them in these things. Now, I don't want to make too far application to this. There are people that do wild things as far as animal rights activists and all this stuff take the care of what we see in the Bible and then they apply it to how it should be for everything. But I don't think we can do that for the text. So if you see somebody do that, just say, okay, and then just move on. Because that's not at all the point of this text. So this is not a lesson on how you treat animals. Lest we forget, because they killed it at the end, right? I'm just saying, like it's dead.
What about how you treat the poor in your community? There definitely makes a point of saying if you can't afford one, your family is not large enough.
Yeah, and I think that's related to the amount of meat that this lamb would produce. If your family would not, if that lamb could provide for you and say your neighbor, right? Not necessarily based upon economic disparity, but if it could, then that would be far better. Is I think the point of what he's getting at, because the point is that nothing should be left at the end of the feast, right? That's the ideal, that nothing should be wasted. But if there is something left, then it needs to be burnt up instead of saved, because all of it is supposed to be dedicated to the Lord. But again, and this gets back to your participatory comment, that they are still supposed to eat this. They are participating in the feast itself by not only preparing it, but also eating from it. This is very different than other forms of religion of this time in the ancient Near East, and also different from other feasts in that this is not one of these times in which the pleasing aroma goes up into the nostrils of God to appease his wrath. This is a moment in which they are sacrificing something as a substitute for their firstborn. That's literally what is being shown here. So I think so to answer your question, I think on the periphery, we can say that it is at least communal focused, in that the entirety of Israel is to participate in. But I think that we can say it's also to be individualistic in its application to one, like it's a substitute for entire family units. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? Any other thoughts? You look like I always look toward Jim, and he's always looking up at the sky.
No.
The thinker.
No. I was just like, because you said it doesn't go. It's not a sort of sacrifice that goes up to the Lord's to appease the Lord's wrath, but it is a substitutionary for the family and community and stuff like that.
Right.
So this is just entertaining, I guess. Would that be an example of substitutionary, just to be simple, substitutionary atonement without like the penal in front of it, or?
I don't think so. So I would still want the penal to be there for a reason that we'll get to at the end of this.
Sure.
The end of this thing.
Yeah.
Predominantly, I'll wet your whistle a little bit in verse 27, where he says, "You shall say, it is a sacrifice of the Lord's Passover." This is the instruction to the kids, right?
Yeah.
For he passed over the houses of the people of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians, but spared, or some translations may say delivered or rescued, is literally the word that's used there, our houses. So there seems to be, and I don't want to jump too much into theological reverb that we'll get to next, there seems to be this aspect that they are supposed to recognize that apart from God's grace on them, their firstborn would be dead too. Does that make sense? So I don't want to remove the penal completely.
Sure.
But only to say this is not there are sacrifices that are specifically oriented to be pleasing aroma to the Lord, and the entirety of it is burnt up, and you don't participate in taking of any of it.
Sure. Yeah.
And then there are other sacrifices that you do partake of as a participatory meal, in that you are not saving yourself, but God is providing for you in His mercy, even in what you do as a response of worship.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah,
rounding out a little
no, that
bit?
makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
So, any other questions? I love this. This is great. Anyway, keep going.
I mean, oh, sorry.
Yeah, go for it.
I mean, as we continue on going down the line, because I know what I'm about to say does have a tendency to maybe trying to disrail. And I'm not trying to take off the rails, but because of when this festival occurs in our current calendar, especially considering that happened when Jesus was crucified and resurrected.
Mhm.
With the Passover being so defined by its rituals of practice for the celebration and remembrance, should we as modern Christians consider any of the idea of the ritual and practice here for our own modern celebration of Easter?
Short answer, yes. We will get to that in the theological reverb slide, which is next.
Okay.
After we go through kind of the practice. And I understand we're already at 7:10, so we're going to continue on. Let's track on here. So it gives what type of animal, the size of the animal, basically as it pertains to who it covers. It gives it the very specific. I'm just going through verses 6 right now. It gives the specific day in which this lamb would be slaughtered. Which, by the way, anyway. This is such a beautiful passage. Like, I just can't help it.
Spend 2 weeks on it.
We probably might. Anyway, it's such a beautiful, because if you take into account some of the works of Josephus, which is a Jewish historian, and also some of the rabbis' understandings of when the lamb was supposed to be slaughtered, like at what point, that they were all about rituals. They're trying to figure out at what exact point to make the festival, and of course you can take this to legalistic extremes, which they did often. At what hour was this lamb supposed to be slaughtered? Obviously, it gives a window, right, from the point in which the sun is going down to the point of when sundown occurs, right? That's when this window is supposed to be. Now, some rabbis would have interpreted that as once it passes midday, technically the sun is going down. So in between midday and dark is the time frame that you could technically kill this lamb. Some would interpret it more stringently, and this is what is so interesting. Josephus has a quote, I can't remember, I think it's in Antiquities, Antiquity of the Jews. He has this quote that it became a regular practice to kill the lamb at 3 p.m. Now, why is that significant?
Guys.
That's the hour that the Gospels proclaim Jesus to have announced it is finished and took his last breath. And the curtain was torn. And anyway, I came across that gem when I was studying this. I was just like, what?
Goosebumps, right?
Yeah, I was like, what in the world?
Goosebumps.
Now, the thing, we have to temper this a little bit, because not every Jew practiced it at 3 o'clock. I don't want to make
Whose writing was this?
Josephus.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
And I think it's in Antiquities of the Jews.
Gotcha.
Or maybe the histories. Anyway, one of those two documents. Josephus, for those that may not be aware, is an ancient Jewish historian who is pretty accurate, minus his inflation of numbers at times, but he is fairly accurate in his historical record keeping. He's considered a generally accurate source of history at that time. But anyway, particularly as it related to the festivals, he was pretty accurate. He was known for being accurate as far as ritualistic aspects of the Jewish faith. So anyway, I just found that extremely intriguing that he connects the killing of this Passover lamb on Passover on the 14th day with 3 o'clock, which would have been the very hour that the gospel writers announced that's when Jesus took his last. So it's just intriguing. So do with that what we will. There's also a discrepancy there that we can get into or not get into as to really between the Exodus account of Passover and how it was announced that it was practiced in Deuteronomy 16. There seems to be some tension there as to how this is practiced, which relates to its movement from individual households practicing it in their home to a more communal temple practice of the Passover. So at this stage of Israel's history, before the temple was built, and really even before the tabernacle was erected, it was very much an in-home, like you did this in-home. Like the Passover was something that you did with your family, right? Deuteronomy 16 seems to paint this portrait of there is this in-home portion, but there's also a communal temple focus as well. And the announcement of the Passover lamb will be killed at the place in which the Lord chooses to make his name dwell, which would have been Jerusalem. Speaking of Jerusalem in the future from Deuteronomy. And so there's this interesting component, that this tension that I like how McConville actually deals with this. But anyway, we won't get too far into that. If you have questions about that, I will answer them if you would like me to. But we're already at 7:15, so we're gonna keep going. So, any questions before I move on then? I know. I don't care. We're studying the scripture, and listen. We're a family, and that's what we're doing. And however long it takes us to get through it, we're gonna take it because it's fun to discuss this stuff. Because it matters, right? It matters. Our study of this word is just as important as our study of Paul. And when we treat the Old Testament as something that is flippant and something that can be thrown away, we literally uproot our faith. Anyway, I'm getting onto another tangent. Thank you, Joanna, for smiling at me because
She
it was a
kicked
tangent.
me though, because I do the same. I've been on a hobby horse about creating canons within a canon.
Oh
Yeah.
man, it happens all the time. And so read your Old Testament. That's the long and short of it. Read your Old Testament, because without it, you wouldn't have roots for your faith. So anyway, I've told the Bartholomew quote way too many times. I'm not going to go through that again. Let's go on to verse 7. Good night. What am I doing? Any questions from the internet land, by the way? I don't want to.
We're all good. We're enjoying it.
Awesome. Okay. Awesome. All right. Well, let's continue on. So then they are to take this blood that is drained from this lamb into this basin, right? Verse 7. Then they shall take some of the blood and put it onto the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the house in which they eat. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted on the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. They shall eat it. Now, these become large components of Passover Seders, which is for Messianic Jews. I don't know if, Joanna, you want to speak to this, but I participate in one as well. It's really neat. I would love for us to do one. But yeah, so essentially each of these components is something that is part of the meal. And so did you want to say anything else to that?
I mean, not really. It's just, I highly recommend it. It's an experience, and like, it's a very humbling experience because they take their time with it. And like you said, every single component has a meaning that they stop and they talk about, and you're like, oh, like we were thinking about this, we're meditating on this, and like, yeah, no, it's very important to them, and it's eye-opening because we don't have that comparison in our traditions.
Right. And the one that you participated in, did they do the Lord's Supper in conjunction with the Seder?
Yeah.
They did not. Okay. Because I've seen both ways, is that they do the Seder itself, they practice the Seder, and then at the end of the Seder, they take the leftover unleavened bread and they use that as a means to practice the Lord's Supper by taking the chalice and dipping it in as the blood and stuff. And it was interesting. I've seen it done both ways. But anyway, so they take this thing, they paint the blood over the doorpost for the purposes that they may be passed over when the destroyer comes. Very specifically, they are to roast the flesh of the lamb. They're not to boil it. They're not to do anything else with it except roast it, right? So the text makes a very distinguished point that they are to only roast it. Later in the recounting of Moses, which we're not going to get to tonight, he actually contrasts that with the boiling of it. He says you cannot boil it. You cannot do anything else other than roast it. Not saying that there's. Anyway, let's continue. They shall eat the flesh that night, roasted on the fire with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, they shall eat it. Bitter herbs in the Seder representing the suffering that occurred in Egypt. That's not immediately apparent, and the text itself does not draw that conclusion for us. However, that's in the tradition of the Jews. That's what they associate the bitter herbs with, is the suffering that they were enduring. Do not eat any of it raw or boiled in water, but roasted, its head with its legs and its inner parts. And you shall let none of it remain until morning. Anything that remains until morning you shall burn. In this manner you shall eat it, with your belt fastened, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. So they were to have their meal during the night, not the daytime, right? So there's this big window in which they could kill the lamb, but the lamb was to be eaten at night. The whole lamb was to be roasted. Think of like a good old-fashioned pig roast, like literally the whole thing is supposed to be roasted, entrails and all of it. It was not to be boiled or eaten raw. There were to be no leftovers. Again, I'm just kind of recounting what God's saying here. The people assembled at the home could not eat it the next morning. It couldn't be like, oh man, I'm gonna have some leftovers today. That was something that was not allowed, right? So no lamb biscuits in the morning could be done. One, because they didn't have leaven, and two, because they weren't allowed to. And so they had to burn up the remainder of it. And fifth, which to our ears, we're like, well, why in the world is that? Why might they need to be dressed for travel? Because that's essentially what he's saying here. With your belt fastened. Yeah, think of the term, you guys have heard, gird up your loins, right? Like you're ready to go. This happens, this phrase is used in 1 Peter. So belt fastened, sandals on your feet, staff in your hand. Why is that such a focus?
They're about to leave.
And it's a sign of faith that they actually trust that God is going to bring this about, because there's a difference between being like, yeah, one day God's going to help save us, and being like, all right, I'm ready to go because God's going to save me and we're going to get out of here.
Today's the day.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. That not only is this commanded of the Lord, so we should do it because he asked them to do it, but it demonstrates their readiness for God's redemption to come. Like the whole idea that is communicated in the song, come Lord Jesus, come Lord, come, right? And then repeated in the New Testament as come Lord Jesus, come, right? This idea that like they are ready for the Lord to work miraculously. As they've seen in the past 9 plagues, they know that this 10th one is coming down on them. So absolutely. Let's continue on. Let's at least get through 13. Anyway. For I will pass through the land of Egypt at night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So again, the Lord's just recounting not only what you're to do, but what you can expect from me, right? So he's laying down not only expectations of them, but what they can expect from the Lord in his arm of mighty power, as it's described throughout the text. For I will pass through the land of Egypt at night. Again, this is just the warning that was given back in chapter 11, is what would take place. What's interesting in this phrase is the judgments that he is pronouncing on the gods of Egypt. Like, what in the world is that meaning? What do you guys think? Because it seems like, okay, you're killing all the firstborns of Egypt, but why are you executing judgments on all the gods of Egypt? He seems to put them in a different category.
Is this? I mean, I know partially it's because each of the plagues really corresponds with one of the gods of Egypt. But like, is it also where we get the idea of the plagues being like individual to each god, and then him ending with the sun, the god of Ra, and all that? Like, is that where we get that idea?
Yes. So that is true. And some theologians, biblical scholars, take each individual plague corresponding to an individual God thing, I think a little bit too far at times.
Right.
So there are some of them that it's very difficult to draw that conclusion to. But at the very least, he is connecting the 10th plague to an affront against the gods of Egypt. At the very least. We also know the sun god that's apparent, right? The frogs, not so much. Did they have a god with the face of a frog? Yeah, but he didn't really do anything
With rock.
with frogs.
Right.
And nor did they, what the frogs did, it didn't really attack that portion of Egyptian society. And so there are some that can definitely be tied to a particular deity, like the Nile, right? The life-giving aspect of the Nile was certainly attacked with the first one. But so I would say not every plague has a direct corresponding god. But yes, this is where a lot of scholars will get that idea that all of the plagues have been an affront against some Egyptian god. But I think to be safe, what we can definitely say is the 10th plague, he is explicitly drawing that connection. What I'm doing in killing the firstborn is an affront, is a judgment against the gods or deities of Egypt. Because again, it's interesting the way that it's worded. I mean, look at it. And I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt. That's the judgment upon the people, right? Both man and beast. That's the judgment on the people. And then he puts these gods being judged separately almost. And on all the gods of Egypt, I will execute judgments. It's like this. I'm judging the people of Israel, or the people of Egypt, by killing all their firstborn of man and beast. And then I'm executing judgment on the gods in this other particular way and demonstrating his, I think it's talking about his power, his just sheer uniqueness. There is no God that rivals him. And I think that's in part what this execution of judgment upon the gods of Egypt is talking about, is that there is no God who can rival me, and they certainly can't stop me from killing the most prized possession of any male in that society. Because that's essentially what God is doing. We don't talk about this a lot, and we'll kind of end tonight with this, but we don't talk about the 10th plague being an affront on the productivity or the progeny. What's the simple word for that? The heirs. Progeny, yeah. The progeny of Egypt, right? Think about how much weight Israel puts on their firstborn, right? I mean, it's a significant amount. Like Abraham literally slept with his wife's mistress trying to get one, right? I mean, there's this idea that your ability to procreate makes you be able to live on, right? This idea is kind of inculcated in all of the ancient Near East. And what God is doing is saying, I have the power to even stop that. Your progeny will not survive. Not only of man, I'm going to kill all your firstborn beasts too. Oh, right. I mean, talk about PETA, like poor animals, right? I mean, my goodness. You see what I'm saying? Like this is significant. Like God is literally saying, I'm going to cut off your ability to continue to exist as a nation. Now, him doing it doesn't end up destroying them completely because they continue as a nation, but in a very shell state from this point forward in history. I mean, they are a military power, right? They're still a main player in the ancient Near East, but they don't have the abundance amount of wealth that they exhibited during this. Before this time.
The history of the Egyptians shows them not being conquered or taken over. So they just kind of faded out of history in the sense of being a power player on the stage.
Yeah, and some of that was due to a lot of really incestuous decisions that they made in their leadership. But the reality is that what God is saying here, I have the power to destroy you as a nation. Your hope for future, because that's what your firstborn son was technically your hope for a future of your family. And I have the ability to stop that.
So I do have a question.
Yeah.
Like, so sometimes, like, so it's interesting because this is one time where it kind of, right, like executing judgments against all the gods of Egypt. It's kind of like, even if it's not to be taken like super literally or metaphorical, it's kind of uh, representing the gods of Egypt as like real beings, right? Even if they don't actually exist, but it's still kind of like portraying them as like real, like hypothetical entities, or like. And there's other, so there's, so I guess that there's times where it says like, you know, where God casts judgments on the gods of fill in the blank, right? And it kind of treats them as like they're real, and other times it treats them as they're actually not real. I can't remember the reference, probably somewhere in the prophets, where it's like they're not even actually gods, they're false gods, they're fake.
Isaiah 40.
Yeah,
With
okay.
the totem that you build the firewood. And,
Okay, yeah. So is there with that like I guess like the question is twofold then, like how should we like, because I know some people will take that as to mean there actually are like, you know, multiple gods, and not, I've heard that like by some people before. But could we also say that the judgment on the false gods is that they are just that, they're actually not even gods? It's that Yahweh is God and they're not.
I mean,
They're
like,
not even gods.
when we were overseas dealing with the Micronesians, they had strong legal spirits. And one of the beliefs they had about the spirits on the land belonged to them. The humans on the land were simply residing in there because the spirits left them. And essentially, that's the same idea. It's like these you just change the language to these are gods. We are residing in God's land. Do things because the gods let us. It's basically the evil one telling a lie and using his demons to spread that lie. That humans are not the most important being in the universe in God's eyes. That the spirits are.
Yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is this idea that if you conquered a people, that was your God conquering their God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so, however, the issue in the ancient Near East is that by and large, everyone except Israel actually believed that was true.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So what I mean by that is that, you know, like I'm just using two examples. So the Assyrians really did believe that the Egyptians had gods, right? And that if they conquered them, that was the Assyrians' gods conquering Egyptian gods. Like they believed in the reality of both those things.
Yeah.
And I think your question is hitting at is that what's kind of being asked?
Yeah, and like so like I guess the question is this is, can we just, yeah, I guess like why would it personify these gods, right? Like make them, is it because like, well, like kind of like I guess there's a couple ways of that you can think of it. Like Jonathan said, like they're actually demonic, right? So they are real beings, but they're not really gods. They're demonic. So in that way, they are kind of false gods in a way, but they're still real beings. There actually are really gods that are lower level than Yahweh. Or this is just kind of phenomenological language to say that they're like that what they see as gods are actually found to be false gods. They're not even, they don't even exist.
And then the second question that you're asking is, what is the judgment upon them?
That they are false gods, that they don't even actually exist, right?
So I think the answer is twofold as well.
Okay.
I think that there is the opportunity that, exactly like Jonathan's pointed out, that there are demonic beings that exemplify themselves in the world and have influenced negatively cultures of the past, which God can be said to conquer, right? So I think there's a possibility that is true. But there also seems to be this idea that, kind of like you're talking about, is that are they, if they're conquerable, are they really even gods?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I think the both and type aspect of this can be applied in that they can equally be like some type of spiritual demonic force that has worked in the past. And this kind of gets at whether or not the magicians were able to actually conjure these things or maybe they're trickery. Right. And so either way that you look at that, it is God conquering them to show them, I think exactly what you're talking about, is that they're not gods.
Yeah. Okay.
They may be some type of spiritual being that has some type of ability to enact the physical world, but they're not gods in the way that they don't have any authority. That the Egyptians are ascribing to them.
Yeah.
Right. Because that was the big component of ancient Near Eastern warfare
Mm-hmm.
was that this God of this land was this God of this land, and your God over there is that's the God of that land.
Mm-hmm.
And if you conquer me, that is your God increasing its territory over my gods.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore they just fall into place or into submission to that
Mhm.
God.
Mm-hmm.
What God's executing judgment upon the gods of Egypt, I think, especially because it's followed up immediately with "I am the Lord,"
Mm-hmm.
right? This redemonstration of His power and authority
Mm-hmm.
through that phrase, because He says that in just a couple of instances throughout this particular text.
Mm-hmm.
But this executing judgments upon the gods of Egypt, I think, is what you're getting at, is this idea that He's demonstrating that they are not gods at all,
Mm-hmm.
but at the very most, they are figments of the spiritual world enacting the physical, and at the very least, nothing but superstition.
Gotcha.
That
Yeah. No, that's it. Yeah.
so I think it's at least those two things.
Okay.
But like I said, I'd be happy to be proved wrong on that. But it seems like the relation to the firstborn and then the pagan deities, as they're kind of conjured up in the mythology of Egypt, that God is lock and step, just demonstrating His his complete authority
Mm-hmm.
over all of the known universe.
Mm-hmm.
And so that, I think, is the judgment that is being pronounced. So, well, I think that's a good stopping point. Verse 7.
So we got to 13. So
Oh yeah, 13. That's right. We did. We got to 13.
Joe, I was really thinking it's almost there, but it's a good break. So much kind of that. When you say like the verse that we get to, I usually like cut it about half. I'm like, that's where we'll probably get to today. No, in a good way, though. In a good way.
Yeah, sure. In a good way.
In a good way. No, I'm being serious.
Tons of shade. Anyway, but yeah, so we will pick up with verse 14 next time, in the how they should memorialize the event. This is God's instruction to them on how they are to memorialize it from this point forward. So this is the initial event that we just covered, and then the memorializing will be a different set of instruction from verses 14 to 20. So any concluding questions, thoughts before we conclude in prayer? All right. Hearing none. Jonathan, would you mind closing us with a word of prayer?
To be mine. Father God, thank you so much for everything you've done, who you are, and what you allow us to do in your name. Father, I pray you'll please continue to grow our relationship with you and with those around us in your name, that we will shine the lights in the community amongst those who know that. Lord, I pray allow us to remember the amazing great things that you have done, much like you've told the Israelites to remember Passover. We'll also remember how you have born, died, and resurrected from the grave for our sins. Lord, I pray you will also allow us to speak your name to all people that we meet, and you'll give us opportunities to share your name with the people that we encounter. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everybody, for being with us tonight. And we will see you on Sunday, again with masks donned, please. And yeah, we will have a wonderful time of worship. Thank you guys for being with us. Good to see you guys.
Thank you. Good seeing you too.